That took less time than I expected. All right, good evening. Thank you so much for battling what we can hope is the home stretch of winter to join us for what I anticipate to be a very unique and moving program. I am Bryn White. I am the archivist for the Century and the executive director. Thank you. I am the executive director of the Century Association Archives Foundation, and it feels perverse to engage in anything resembling self-promotion on a night celebrating a woman who had no knack or inclination for such things. But I am duty-bound to reiterate that the foundation is a separate 501c3 that was set up in 1997 to assure that the documentary trail of the century was preserved, promoted, and made accessible to all while remaining within the clubhouse walls. The foundation is part of what makes the Century unique as the only New York City private club to maintain a full-time professional archivist and to proactively work with qualified researchers. Last year, we answered a new record of 238 questions from members, staff, and the public. 2024 was also a banner year as we debuted our redesigned website at centuryarchives.org to better showcase our collections and digital resources such as a searchable member directory of the over 3,000 centurions who joined through 1922, which we are hoping to expand. I hope if you have not done so, you will check out that website. And I have to sincerely thank everyone who generously contributed to our annual fall solicitation, as we are chiefly dependent on tax-deductible donations from members for all of these initiatives. And it's never too late to give. Our new website does offer direct and secure online payment options. Moving up from the print checks, guys. But there are, of course, other ways to support us in your fall mailing. You got a postcard for sharing a favorite Century story with the archives. Our speaker tonight, Roseanne Cash, did hers right away. What are you waiting for? I have some of them out on the table. I'm keeping them stocked in the Century Administrative Office, where you can also place them in my mailbox, so it won't even cost you a stamp. And as we have new capabilities now to publish illustrated essays, online exhibitions, and more on the new website, I hope anyone with the itch to dive into Century and Century-adjacent history on a public educational platform will be in touch with me about their ideas. And I should also note that the video recordings of our prior events, including the great Thelma Schoonmaker in conversation with Nancy Franklin on her husband, the film director and centurion Michael Powell, and the Morgan Library curators of the current Belle DaCosta Green exhibition are available on the website, as this one will soon be. But don't worry, none of your faces will be featured. This event originated in a rather magical way that really does speak to the wondrous discoveries to be made through archives and the equal importance of the curious and dedicated researcher. In February 2022, I'd only been in this job for a little over a month. I and all my new colleagues were still wearing masks. I barely knew how to get the scanner, which I have nicknamed the Beast, to work. But I got my first really good reference question. A woman assisting tonight's speaker, Howard Fishman, in what was then his 12-year investigation into Connie Converse, wrote me about Andrew Burris, a friend of Connie's who it seemed had worked at the Century for decades. I was familiar with Converse and was riveted to find a most unexpected connection to her through the Century, and not one through a member, but an employee. This sent me on my own years spanning and still continuing construction of the life of Burris, whose signature dots perhaps more documents in the Century archives than any other person, as he was the chief administrative employee from 1925 to 1970. This mission was graciously and gracefully picked up by member Mark Whitaker, who delivered a powerful monthly meeting address last June on Burris, and that is available as a recording and a transcript through the archives, AKA me, if you had the misfortune to miss it last summer. Howard was also instrumental to Mark and myself getting us in touch with the woman whom Burris would take to the museums when she was a child, and who said she remembered everything about him, even how he smelled, which was clean, in case you were wondering how, like I was. He also shared a 1963 letter that Burris had written Connie, telling her how he was too tired from his day job to concentrate on his own artistic input, and how proud he was of her for producing and getting her work heard. Burris is also featured in an exhibition I recently installed on the Century staff in the lobby. I felt it was vital to complement the other case I installed on Ralph Ellison and the 5 men who followed him as the first modern African-American members of the Century. But we wanted to acknowledge and explore the club's employees, who were majority Black for the bulk of the 20th century and who had been here all along, often working here for decades. Hanging above the case celebrating the pioneering members who crossed the Century's color line is a portrait of Ellison, recently donated to the Archives Foundation by the Burns Schwartz Foundation, so that we can now commemorate the incredible milestone of his election within the clubhouse. And I must also plug the recent publication, Ralph Waldo Ellison Centurion, edited by Paul Devlin and James Pinero, featuring a personal remembrance by Rosanna Warren, who was the daughter of Ellison's proposer, Robert Penn Warren. It was the poets who integrated the Century, Ellison once exclaimed. And it has an essay by Devlin and transcripts from the archives of Ellison's new members address in the 70s and a memorial celebration hosted here at the Century by Dr. Henry Louis Gates. This too is available on the archives website through our digital library, and there's a limited run of print copies that you may purchase through the Century admin office. And now, back to Connie. That single letter to her from Andrew Burris offered such a precious glimpse into that man for whom our records here of the institution and the social networks of members contained little to no evidence of his own. And it was found in a file cabinet that was maintained and left behind by Converse. And it was, of course, impossible to resist inviting Howard to the Century to discuss his wondrous encounter of this personal archive and how it informed his exploration of an even more enigmatic figure. We were going to keep it cozy in the billiard room tonight, but there proved to be too many of you. So I'm thrilled to see that in the 21st century, the drawing power of Connie Converse is moving her out of the underground. She was limited to in her lifetime, thanks in large part to the efforts of Howard, and also enormous thanks to Roseanne, who I asked right away to join us, believing her to be the ideal complement to this discussion. She asked me to give her some time, and she only took 10 minutes to think about it and joined in. So please join me in turning things over to them.
Thank you all for coming out. I don't remember very many events presented by the archives, so this is exciting that Bren is starting to do this, and thank you, Bren. And the connection with Andrew Burris is so interesting. It seems that at some point in your life that all connections and circles eventually converge. I was enthralled by Howard's book. Connie Converse. I didn't know her music until I read your piece in the New York Times and then the following piece in the New Yorker, and was so interested in her life and then this book. And I didn't know her music until reading your pieces about her. She was really a singer-songwriter before the term was invented. But Howard, I wanted to ask you, I mean, this is more than a decade of research and writing into this woman. You went from New York to New Hampshire to Ann Arbor to Prague and back to find people who knew her and to get in the filing cabinet, which I want you to speak more about, which is kind of the reason for this whole event. And I wanted to ask you about your obsession. And I don't use that term pejoratively. I love obsession. So tell me about that.
Okay, thanks. Hi, everybody. And I'm just curious because, you know, Roseanne hadn't heard of Connie Converse, and I think it's still the case that a lot of people have not heard about Connie Converse. I hope that the day will come before too long where I'm doing these events and everybody will know all about Connie Converse. I don't think we've arrived at that day yet, so I'm just curious. Clap your hands if you've heard Connie Converse's music before. right. Some of you. And then clap your hands if you've never heard her music before. More of you. Okay. It's good to know. I first heard a Connie Converse song in 2010. I was at a holiday party, didn't know many of the people there. I felt awkward and anxious about making small talk, so I was studying the books on the shelves. And a song came on, and we're going to hear that song right now.
How about Too Tall Mountain? Can't miss with that.
In between two tall mountains, there's a place they call lonesome. Don't see why they call it lonesome. I'm never lonesome when I go there. See that bird sitting on my windowsill? Well, he's saying whippoorwill all the night through. See that brook running by my kitchen door? Well, it couldn't talk no more if it was you. Up that tree, there's sort of a squirrel thing. Sounds just like we did when we were quarreling. In the yard, I keep a pig or two. They drop in for dinner like you used to do. I don't stand in the need of company with everything I see talking like you. Up that tree, there's sort of a squirrel thing. Sounds just like we did when we were quarreling. You may think you left me all alone, but I can hear you talk without a telephone. I don't stand in the need of company with everything I see talking like you. See that bird sitting on my windowsill? Well, he's saying whippoorwill all the night through. Just whippoorwill all the night through. In between two tall mountains, there's a place they call lonesome. Don't see why they call it lonesome. I'm never lonesome, now I live there.
When did you write that?
So this song completely discombobulated me. I could not figure out what era it came from, what the style was. It sounded to me like it had elements of Hoagie Carmichael, but it also had elements of the Carter family and elements of American Hymn. And she's talking about a squirrel thing. So I went and I found the host who was playing the music, and I said, "What in the world did we just hear?" And he said, "Oh, that's Connie Converse. She made these recordings in the 1950s in her apartment in Greenwich Village. She never had any success. One day she drove away and disappeared and was never heard from again. And just last year, these guys in Brooklyn put out an album of her 1950s home recordings."
Now, Howard, a lot of people would say, well, that's a folk singer, that's a folk song, but you say that she's not a folk singer. And why is that?
Well, at that point, I didn't know what she was. I
Right.
just felt like it was a mash of a lot of different styles. And he was calling her somebody, he was saying that this is somebody from the 1950s. And I knew that in the 1950s, people were not writing and singing their own songs.
That's right.
You know, this was 10 years before Bob Dylan, and 10 years before the cafe scene explosion, the coffee house explosion in Greenwich Village.
So the way she sounds, you would think that this was a folk singer, but folk singers in the 1950s were singing traditional music.
Folk music.
Yeah, traditional music.
If you were playing folk music in the 1950s, you were playing songs that were not written by anybody. You know, they were traditional songs that were handed down. They had no known composer, no known lyricist, And in the 50s, if you were part of the folk scene, which there was a folk scene, but you were not writing your own songs, and if you were not allowed in the folk scene. Like, that was heresy.
You have described her as someone out of time, and partly because of that, what you've just said about her music. I mean, and also it really fascinates me that she's not professionally trained, she wasn't a professional musician, and yet her sense of harmonic intervals is so sophisticated, and her pitch is really good as well. You would think, where did this come from?
Yeah. Well, I should say that at that point in 2010, I left. I don't remember leaving that party. I just knew that I ran out of there. And I had to find out more about who this person was. And on the way home, I stopped at a record store in Brooklyn, in my neighborhood, and Brooklyn was still hip at that point, and so they had copies of the Connie Converse CD, and I took it home, and I went to Google, and there was nothing about Connie Converse. Nothing, zero, nothing. You could not find any information about this person, to the extent that I felt like, well, maybe this is not even a real person, because there were no news articles about her disappearance. There were no reviews of her shows. Obviously, she put out no albums. So that then led to, the word obsession was used, which is, I don't mind that, but I felt like I got seized by the ghost of this woman somehow. One of the centurions who's here tonight emailed me after reading my book and listening to her music, and he used the word bewitched. He said he felt bewitched by her. That is how I felt. And that led to, now there's a lot more information about her. This is 12 years later. But there was nothing in this book that I found that was available at that point. So it was all question marks.
So she really lived, speaking of someone out of time, she was writing her own songs in a kind of folk tradition when nobody was doing that. Her gifts exceeded her ambition by far, and there was no way to market her. She didn't make a record. She resisted any, if there were any attempts actually, to fit her into, marketing then for women, well, it still is, that a woman who was a performer had to fit some version of the male gaze, becoming something for the male gaze for that, as a marketing tool. So that was off the table too. She didn't really have a manager. She didn't perform in public. This was recorded in her kitchen or her apartment.
In her apartment, yeah. Well, that recording we just heard was recorded in somebody's living room. She did give house concerts.
Oh, right.
But maybe would it be helpful for me to give like a 2-minute just biographical sketch of who she was, and then I want to get into this conversation because you have such a unique perspective on her career and what it means to be a woman songwriter. And so let's get into that. But just very briefly, so the thumbnail sketch of her life. She was born in Concord, New Hampshire. She was a brilliant student, valedictorian of her high school class. She got a full ride scholarship to Mount Holyoke. Then she dropped out after 2 years, mysteriously. For 9 months, I couldn't pin down her whereabouts anywhere. Then she pops up in New York City for the first time in February 1945, working for a humanitarian think tank called the American Institute for Pacific Relations. She works there for about a half a dozen years. The organization comes under the suspicion of having communist ties. The House Un-American Activities Committee investigates them. She loses her job there, and she starts to devote herself full-time to playing music. And she gets an apartment on Grove Street in Greenwich Village. She's living by herself. She's not known to have any significant others at any point in her life, although she did have affairs with people, inappropriate affairs or affairs with people that were involved with other people. And she's writing and recording these songs in her home and playing at these house concerts. And then in 1954, somehow, she gets an invitation to be on the CBS morning show with Walter Cronkite. And Bryn, can we see that slide? There she is next to Walter Cronkite. So the CBS Morning Show was, at that point, recorded in a studio over Grand Central Station, right over here. And the show itself was broadcast live in Grand Central Station on the terminal level. So everybody walking to work that morning saw Connie Converse on TV. How she got this engagement is completely mysterious. She had no engagements to promote. She had no albums out. Nobody was covering her songs, and yet here she is on TV. So at that point, she got a manager. The manager tried to get her a recording contract unsuccessfully.
You should say there's no footage of that, though.
There is no footage.
You can't see that.
You cannot see that appearance. All there are these photographs that she had in her filing cabinet. The footage doesn't exist. Trust me, I turned over every rock. It's not there. So she started, she seems to have had a change of heart artistically. She stopped writing these sort of delightful songs and started writing much darker art song for classical voice and piano. And didn't get anywhere with that. Was working on an opera, didn't get anywhere with that. And in 1961, in January of 1961, the same month that Bob Dylan moved to Greenwich Village, she left New York for good and moved to the Midwest. She reinvented herself in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which at that time was a hotbed of liberal social activist activity. She became an activist. She became a public thinker. She went to work for the Journal for Conflict Resolution and worked under Kenneth Boulding, who was a Nobel Prize-nominated economist and peace theorist. She was writing and editing for them. She helped organize the first teach-in in Ann Arbor and was sort of involved with this activist milieu but became burned out very quickly by overwork, by alcoholism, by depression, and by the early 70s, she had left that job. She took a sabbatical to England. She came back from England. She tried this, she tried that, nothing really worked. And in 1974, 1 week after her 50th birthday, she wrote letters to family and friends saying, I'm going to start a new life. Some of them, she said, I'm going back to New York. Others, she said, don't come looking for me, and she was not specific about where she was going. She got in her Volkswagen Bug and drove away and was never heard from again. And her body was never found. The car was never found. And if she's still around, she is 100 years old today.
Do you know, sometimes I hear you speak about her in the present tense, though. Do you think she's still alive?
Well, probably not.
Probably not.
Yeah. But anyway, that's the overview.
You've missed a really important point.
Tell me.
How much she hated Richard Nixon.
Yes, she disappeared in August of 1974, and she was planning this disappearance for some time. You know, she was getting her belongings together, and she was creating this smokescreen for her vanishing. But according to her nephew, who was the last person to see her alive in Ann Arbor, the Watergate situation was happening, and she hated Richard Nixon with such a passion, which dated back to his being part of the House Un-American Activities Committee, that she wanted to wait until he resigned so she could see his face as he said it on TV, and then she got in her car and drove away.
That's so good. So tell us about this one recording, this one album, How Sad, How Lovely.
Yeah, so in 2004, one of the people that recorded her was invited onto David Garland's WNYC show, Spinning on Air. And the guy's name was Gene Deitch. He was an animator and an illustrator. And he would have people to his house up in Westchester in the 50s. And he invited musicians to come and play house concerts, and he would record them. And David Garland knew this about Gene Deitch, so he said, why don't you bring some of those recordings when you come on, and we'll play some of them. And one of the songs that was played that night was a Connie Converse song. And driving down the highway on the New Jersey Turnpike that night was a young man named Dan DeZula, who had a similar reaction to mine when I first heard her. He pulled his car off the side of the road, thought, what in the world am I listening to? Pulled out a pen and his driver's registration, his car registration from his glove compartment, and wrote down the name Connie Converse and the name of the song, drove home, did the same thing, went online, couldn't find anything about her, and started the process of contacting the station, who contacted David Garland, who contacted Connie Converse's living brother, who cleared the music for release. And that's the album that came out in 2009. And at some point, we're going to hear another one of her songs, and that's up to you when you want to do that.
Let's play that now.
Okay.
This is from How Sad, How Lovely.
This is from How Sad, How Lovely. Yeah. And you can flip that slide.
People say a roving woman is likely not to be better than she ought to be. So when I stray away from where I've got to be, someone always takes me home. A lady never should habituate saloons, and that is where I find myself on many afternoons. But just as I begin to blow away the foam, someone tips his hat to me and takes me home. People say a rolling woman is likely not to be better than she ought to be. So when I stray away from where I've got to be, someone always takes me home. Now poker is a game a lady shouldn't play, and every floating poker game just seems to float my way. But long before I've lost a thing besides my comb, someone tips his hand to me and takes me home. Don't see why they always do it. Can't be vanity, must be sheer humanity, when some kind soul remarks with great urbanity, lady, let me take you home. Of course there's bound to be some little aftermath that makes a pleasant ending for the straight and narrow path. And as I go to sleep, I cannot help but think how glad I am that I was saved from cards and drink. People say a roving woman is likely not to be better than she ought to be. So when I stray, there's positively got to be someone there to take me home.
That's my favorite song of hers. And, you know, great song about one-night stands.
Yeah. And back to what you were saying, I mean, not what women were supposed to be singing about in the 1950s.
I mean, sadly, I don't think she had a chance. She wasn't...
Say more about that.
Yeah. Well, she wasn't traditionally attractive, and she actually took that to an extreme. Some people said her hygiene wasn't that great. She dressed kind of in rebellion to what other women were dressing like. She was staggeringly intelligent, and that could put people off. She wasn't, you know, endearing or obsequious in any way.
None at all, no.
Yeah, so, and then, like I said, her gifts exceeded her ambition. She had no way to fit into any kind of marketing scheme. There was just no chance for her.
Yeah, I mean, there are letters in which she talks about going to audition for music publishing companies and being told, lovely songs, Miss Converse, but not commercial. We have no way to market you.
I've heard that. In fact, very early in my career, some publisher said to me, well, you can't really sing, you can't really write songs, but I think you're pretty commercial. So I spent the rest of my life proving him wrong.
Yeah, how can you imagine her in that scene in the 50s?
No, it wasn't. I mean, in 1982, I was making my second album, or 1981, and I went to a marketing meeting. I'm telling this story because I see another great singer-songwriter here, and I think there's another one here too. I went to this marketing meeting, all men in the boardroom, was the only woman, and I hope I can say this word here. And they said, well, our chief marketing tool for this record is to make you seem more fuckable. And that still goes on, you know.
So you can imagine, I mean, we can imagine.
That was in the 80s, right? Yeah.
Yeah, in the 50s. And she had no interest in tailoring what she was doing to make herself commercial.
That's right.
At all.
Right.
So, yeah, go ahead.
I need you to talk about the filing cabinet,
okay,
because that is why this whole thing came about.
So after Connie Converse's ghost seized me, and I was telling everybody that I knew about her music and trying to find everything I could to know about her, I found an email for her brother who was living in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I wrote to him and I said, you know, I want to try to help find more recognition for your sister's work. I think it's just incredible and everybody needs to know about it. And he was very polite in getting back to me right away, and that began a correspondence. We started emailing all the time, and I was asking him all kinds of questions, and he was leading me to various people that she knew. We were talking on the phone, and finally he said, Howard, it seems like you're serious about this. Why don't you come out here to Ann Arbor? I have all of Connie's stuff out here in a filing cabinet in my garage. So I booked a ticket to Ann Arbor, you know, and I will say that, you know, this book came out 1.5 years ago, and it was a 12-year endeavor, and for 10 and a half of those years, I didn't have a publishing contract. So, you know, I was just winging it, and anyway, so I went out to Ann Arbor, and he took me out to his garage, and there was this 5-drawer metal filing cabinet. And in it, it was not just a random collection of bric-a-brac. This was a meticulously organized thing with a 9-page typed table of contents, what was in every single drawer, what was in every single folder. It was hundreds of letters, hundreds of photographs, all this music, the investigations into race relations, into game theory, into statistics, the remnants of an opera, these art songs.
You should say, too, that she kept carbon copies of all the letters she had written.
She typed all her letters, and she kept carbon copies of every single one. And there were pictures of her artwork. Bryn, can we see a couple of pictures of her artwork? There's one of her paintings. There's a copper mask that she cast. She also did political cartoons, or New Yorker-style cartoons. This one says, I kept wondering why he didn't apply for unemployment insurance. Death of a salesman. This is a published cartoon. I think that's the end of the art slides, right? Okay, I just wanted to throw in a few of those. Yeah, this woman was a polymath. She was brilliant at everything that she did. And so I spent all kinds of time with that filing cabinet, and that became the motherlode of everything that came after, including this guy, Andrew Burris, who worked here at the Century. There was a photograph in Connie Converse's scrapbook of a young girl, and it said next to it, Andrea Mahey. There she is. And I had this wonderful research assistant working with me, the same one that contacted Bryn, and my assistant found an Andrea Mahey living in New York City and a phone number. And I contacted her, and she didn't know anything about Connie Converse, but she confirmed that her mother was the Elizabeth Mahey that there was correspondence with between Connie Converse and her mother. And I said, how do you think they knew each other? And she said, oh, I bet it was through my mother's friend, Andrew Burris, who was a gay black playwright living in Greenwich Village. And, oh, there was a letter from an Andrew, no last name, in the filing cabinet that talked about taking young Andrea to a museum and talked about her mother, Lizzie. And I sent her the letter and she said, yes, that's Andrew Burris. So at that point, I had my research assistant contact Bryn, and that is why we're here today.
Amazing. I want to ask you about, because we're going to get to some questions in a few minutes, but I wanted to ask you about her disappearance and her family. I mean, I think one of the things that really constricted her was that she came from a very conservative Baptist family who did not approve of what she was doing. So that was another count against her. But the odd thing about Phil and her mother and her other brother is that when she disappeared, they didn't really look for her.
That's correct.
And why do you think that is?
Phil said it was because he wanted to respect her wishes, and that in a letter that she wrote to him, which never turned up, even though everything else turned up, she expressed to him that she did not want anyone to come looking for her, and he wanted to be, that's what he told me, that he wanted to be respectful.
But you never saw that letter.
I never saw that letter, and Phil then told me and told other people who interviewed him that he did, in fact, go to a private detective to find out what it would take to hire the guy to go looking for her. And the private detective, according to Phil, said, well, you know, everyone has a legal right to disappear. So even if I find your sister and she doesn't want to be found, I can't tell you where she is. Which doesn't sound quite right.
That's a weird, yeah.
But that's the story that Phil told, and he stuck to it.
But her mother also didn't look for her.
Nobody looked for her. There was no missing persons report filed. Yeah, it was, the end of Connie Converse's story was not a slow fade to black. It was blackout.
Right, so
she drove away and that was it.
Her mother lived another 30 years.
That's right.
After Connie's disappearance, but made no effort to
20 years, yeah, but
20
yes,
years,
never looked for her.
That's just incomprehensible.
Yeah, it's crazy, but the other thing, you know, somebody here tonight, we were talking about Connie Converse's story, and this person had just recently done a deep dive into her story and said, you know, once you get to know who this person was, her disappearance suddenly stops being the least interesting, stops being the most interesting thing about her story. I mean, her life is actually more interesting than the fact that she disappeared, which is saying something.
A person out of time with unexplained gifts and bad timing. To leave Greenwich Village a month, or the same month that Bob Dylan arrives. I mean, she could have somehow integrated into the folk scene, the cafe scene in the village. Probably, don't you think?
I mean, who's to say, but certainly it seems an extraordinary moment of bad timing.
Yeah, and to sink into the depression she went into too, it was deathly.
Yeah.
That and her alcoholism. By the end of her life.
Yes, she was a very empathic person, and she was in despair about the state of the country and the world.
Can I read something that she wrote about that?
Yeah,
it
you
seems
can.
like
Yeah.
you set that up. You lobbed that one right off of the plate.
Go for it. Yeah.
She wrote this. Is this from the Journal of Conflict Resolution?
No, this is a diary entry that was in the filing cabinet from 1950.
1950.
Yeah.
1950, she wrote, so we plunge from a bright, if bloody history into a dark and bloody future. I cannot help this private pessimism. The sun shines in many places, but this continent seems to be declining into a long winter. And all our strength, all our warm tradition may not be enough to hold it back. We have become a nation of awful paradox. hysteria inlaid with unconcern, literacy woven with misconception, democracy wrapped up in tyranny, boldness nailed down by fear. I have no doubt of the outcome, but I dread the interval. Is that prescient or what?
We can go in all kinds of directions in terms of this talk now. We can talk more about her songwriting. We can talk a little bit more about the things she did other than music. We could also take questions. What would you...
think, how about we play one more song and then take questions?
Okay. Then we're going to get the bonus track, which I hadn't planned to play, but we will play.
Bonus track.
And we
Love
won't
it.
hear the whole thing, but this is, I just wanted, if we had time, I wanted people to have a sense of the kind of songs she started writing once she moved to the piano and started writing more formal music. It's almost like, it sounds like a different composer. Can we hear Vanity of Vanities in just maybe a minute of it?
When I came to Tombstone, there was a man there could change copper into gold with a brown bucket full of cloudy water and a magic 10-penny nail. This will take a while, says he. Put your pennies in the pail. Find yourself some scenery.
Okay, that's good.
Do you know, that to me just shows where her inner life was at that moment. The piano's out of tune, her voice has lost some of its resonance, her chord changes are slightly disturbing. I mean, what was happening at that moment, the art songs?
She had moved from Greenwich Village to Harlem, and she was living with her older brother, who was not a nice fellow. Her older brother and her sister-in-law and their baby. And it was a very fraught living situation. She had gotten nowhere with her guitar songs. She was working a day job at a printing company. She was drinking more. It was not a good time.
You can definitely hear that. Let's take some questions.
Great.
Bren, will you, I know centurions like to eat right around 7, so we won't go over. I'm one of those. So will you cue us, Bren, when it's time? Yes, ma'am.
Given that she worked for various leftist humanitarian organizations, was there an FBI file, given the time?
I'm sorry, was there what?
Was there any kind of FBI file? Was there anything like that?
The question is, was there any FBI file? No. There are no police records or any kind of legal records of her disappearance to this day.
So I think I've got the microphone. So you've given birth to her for us, and you've stewarded her life, and now you've had to let her go. What's your relationship with her now? Do you mourn her?
What a great question,
That's
Chris.
a beautiful question. Thank you. The book, as I said, the book came out a year and a half ago, and I'm still giving these talks, and I will go anywhere where anybody wants me to talk about Connie Converse, because I feel that the mission doesn't end until she's a household name, and that hasn't happened yet. So I'm continuing to do talks, and we'll see how far it goes.
I think you had a past life relationship with her.
I just feel like what she did was so important, and she was invisible for various reasons, and that was a tragedy.
It's a worthy mission, Howard. Markley.
I wonder whether you could say anything about her influences and who she influenced, if anyone? I mean, do you have any idea of who she was listening to that kind of formed her this way? And do you have any sense that her music was heard by anyone that went on to kind of take it in?
Right, great question about her influences and people that might have been influenced by her. Her brother told me that they were avid listeners to the hit parade in the 30s and 40s, and that she felt that American pop music was mostly crap, with one exception, All the Things You Are, which she thought was a very finely constructed song. But she felt that the lyrics were not very good, and that the songs were harmonically not very interesting. I think she did listen to a lot of classical music. She seemed to be an omnivorous listener. I think she listened to everything. The question of was anyone influenced by her is such a tantalizing one, because on the one hand she had no recordings for people to hear, and that TV show, there was no repeat of it, the appearance with Cronkite, and I interviewed just about everybody I could find that was still, I couldn't get to Bob Dylan, but just about everybody else from the early 60s who was still around. Nobody to a person had ever heard of Connie Converse. It was like she wasn't even there. But she was playing these house concerts, and I found people in their 80s and 90s who, when I contacted them, would sing me her songs over the phone. They would sing them to me, not having any recordings of her. So this was 60 years since the last time they heard these songs. And when I talked to memory specialists about this, they said, well, yes, depending on the way the experience is encoded in the brain, if it's really powerful, we can remember things many, many decades later. So if she was having this kind of influence on people, could people have heard her that then went on to fame and fortune? Maybe. It's a nice thought, but there's no way to prove it.
Maybe.
Laura?
Okay. I just finished the book last night, by the way, so I have a lot of thoughts, but I will keep this within shooting distance of dinner at 7. So you just talked about how she thought most of a kind of popular song of the time of her youth was crap. However, she did talk a little bit about the rubric that she created to try to analyze what makes a popular song. And then I have a second part of my question, which is really just a second question, which is, you mention in the book that that in approaching the story, the idea of her leaving New York was this retreat from this creative time, but that actually when you went into the filing cabinet, you found that she had this incredible intellectual life that must have also been very exciting. After all of the, engaging with all of those facets of her work, is it possible, or did you find something in addition to her music that you felt was even more compelling, her intellectual work and her peace activism and all of that? Sorry.
Thank you for that question. In reverse order, yes, I think her intellectual activities were incredible and way ahead of their time. And I had to lobby my editor at Dutton to include in the appendices a manifesto that she wrote about institutional racism in 1969 that is just decades ahead of what people are talking about today. She was a ferocious intellect, and she could see the future. So that's what I found in the filing cabinet, and I'm hoping that in time, those kinds of investigations that she was doing will be as celebrated as her music is. But first we have to get her music celebrated, and then we'll get to that stuff. And then the question about the study that she did. So after she moved to Ann Arbor, and in Ann Arbor, by the way, after she recreated herself as an intellectual, nobody in Ann Arbor knew anything about her being a songwriter. They knew nothing about her life in New York of trying to succeed in music, and to them she was this sort of off-putting, very smart intellectual. So one of the projects that I found was something she called a statistical summary of 1,000 melodies. And using index cards and a graph, she chose 1,000 songs from all different genres, not 100 songs, 1,000 songs, entered them on this graph, entered 80 different points of data points. Things like the first note of the song, the second note of the song, the distance between the first note and the second note of the song, basically trying to make an analog computer examination of what makes a good song good. So yeah, that's what.
Do you think that was an impediment for her?
Say more about that.
No, you say more about that.
This is what Connie Converse did for fun. Yeah. And so did it keep her from having a more robust social life? Did it keep her from having significant others? Did it keep her from some kind of normalcy? Maybe.
I would think.
Maybe, but, it's also, well, yeah.
I mean, I can only imagine the self-torment that went on because of her discomfort in the world in so many ways, not just the wider world, but her body,
Yes.
she had no relationships that were in the open.
Right.
Her parents.
Yeah, she had all these struggles. And I think that the clear thing about Connie Converse is that she didn't suffer fools. And so she didn't have time for, things that maybe other people make time for. But one of the things that I say in my book is that I feel that my sense is that she would rather be alone than suffer fools, but also she would rather not be alone.
Not be alone.
So I think she invested her energy into these projects because it was a way to give her life meaning.
Yeah. Joan.
Yeah, I'm really struck by the sort of, I guess, personality type, if you will. That's maybe not a great word, but to me it seems like if someone were to diagnose her in retrospect, that she would be on the autism spectrum, having the obsessional behaviors and a special interest that takes over the mind, someone who's incredibly intelligent, someone who does not, as you say, suffer fools, doesn't understand the social niceties. Has anyone sort of looked at her through that lens at all?
I mean, I talked to mental health professionals, and we got into this a little bit, but the line is, you can't diagnose somebody who's not here. So that's as far as that conversation went. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing to think about, but there's no way to say. Yeah.
Oh, here.
Well, we were in Ann Arbor 1961, 63, and so was
amazing.
Bob Dylan. And Bob Dylan came and he sang at the Ann Arbor High School auditorium, so she might have met him.
In there, yeah.
That's one thing. Secondly, there were manifesto writers in Ann Arbor every block. We had the Unabomber. We had Tom Hayden with the Port Huron Manifesto. I wrote a manifesto for the 50th reunion of the infamous class of 1968. And so she had a context.
Did you know Connie Converse?
Are you kidding me? I was at the first teach-in. She could have been right next to me. Wow. We all were, we don't need a spectrum. We were neurodiverse. We were happy. We wanted to change the world. She was a part of something larger. I doubt she was isolated. I'm sure there were so many people floating through that were brilliant. Iggy Pop came out, I can't even begin to get into what happened with the sexual revolution. It was just
No,
you know.
please.
I mean, well, yes. I was in the art school, and, you know, it was the kind of thing you'd walk by your locker and somebody was in there and somebody was against them, you know. It was just, so I don't think it was not very New England, let me put it that way.
Thank you so much.
Do you know, one response to that, yeah, thank you, that, we need to talk later. But she may not have been isolated in the social sense, but she was definitely isolated inside. And I think that was part of the problem. Bren, how much time do we have?
I have a microphone. I lived in Ann Arbor too, and that's what I feel a connection with her.
That's her in Ann Arbor, by the way.
Yeah, I love Ann Arbor. But what I was talking about, what I wanted to talk about, is you were talking about how she analyzed the melody, each note of the second note, the third note of a song. But for me, the music was amazing, but her words were incredible. So it wasn't like just the music was amazing, but the words were amazing.
She had a wonderful ability to combine nature metaphors with real life images, with sexual overtones, with, you know, like so many paths she went down in one song. Curtis.
I see a camera in that picture. And I wonder if there are any photographs in those files. And then, of course, I think of Vivian Mayer, who was, you know, an unknown photographer who burst on the world and is still bursting, never published in her life. So those are, but were there any negatives? I do hope so.
There are so many pictures, and you know, I was really lucky. I don't know how I got so lucky to get the editor at Dutton that I got, but there are so many pictures in this book that they let me put in, and yeah, one is more crazy and beautiful than the next.
Okay, thank you.
Bren I think Bren wants to say something.
Well, I don't get the impression people are rushing to dinner. If you want to take a few more questions. And also, we do have a final song. I don't know if you still want me to.
Yeah, right. Okay, 2 more questions in the final song. Should we do that? Yeah? Okay. We've completely lost control, Howard.
Okay. All right. I thought there was no chance I was getting the microphone.
Yes.
I just want to thank you both for all you've done to get Connie Converse sort of more in the public eye. I hadn't heard of her. I saw her on like a YouTube, low-grade YouTube file, and you know, was moved. I don't know. You're a hard act to follow. My generation has done less, but it's the one I love. And, you know, because that's where all the people I love are. But I guess, you know, there's nothing more beautiful in the world than mystery, except maybe the past, because that's the only thing you have. And, you know, at the risk of insulting that, is there anything else you found? Like, did you find recordings of her, or like sheet music, or anything she ever put down that's not what we've found so far?
Yes, there's all kinds of stuff, but not enough time tonight to talk about it, unfortunately. But thank you for that comment.
Though.
What's that?
It's in the book, though, right?
It's in the book. Yeah.
I would add longing to mystery. Yeah, that's one thing that we share. All of humans.
There's a microphone being held up back here. Yes.
Okay, one more question.
Yes, thank you. I'm just wondering, it may be too long, what you make of that filing cabinet and the fact that she kept everything, and not just kept it, but organized it, you know, had a table of contents, from a
It's a great
research
last
standpoint?
question. It's a great last question. Thank you. Two things about the filing cabinet. One, when I went into that filing cabinet and when I found that table of contents that was 9 pages long and typed and meticulously organized, a number of the items that were listed were crossed out, and next to the cross out was the word dumped. And it was not Connie Converse's handwriting. Phil Converse, her brother, who devoted a lot of his post-retirement life to getting her music out there and was her biggest fan, curated that filing cabinet after she left and threw out a lot of stuff. He plays a supporting role in this story, and we can't get into it tonight, but it's a big part of the narrative, and it's part of the book, and if that interests you, there's more to be said. Number one. Number two, on August 10th, 1974, the last time Connie Converse was seen, the night that she drove out of town, she could have taken that filing cabinet out to the curb and left it for the garbage man. She did not do that. She could have erased her life entirely. I believe that she knew that she lived a life of intention and consequence, and that people would find what she did one day.
Well said, Howard. That's well said.
So, we're going to wrap it up. I want to thank Roseanne for having this conversation with me.
Thank you, Howard.
And Bryn for having us, and the archives for having us.
Thank you, Bryn.
We're going to hear one last song, and this is the song that David Garland played in 2004 that caused Dan DeZula to swerve off the road and write down the name Connie Converse, that led to all of us being here tonight and people discovering her music. This song is called One by One.
We go walking in the dark. We go walking out at night, and it's not as lovers go two by two, to and fro, but it's one by one, one by one. We go walking out at night, as we wander through the grass. We can hear each other pass, but we're far apart, far apart in the dark. We go walking out at night, with the grass so dark and tall. We are lost recall, if the moon is down and the moon is down. We are walking in the dark. If I had your hand in mine, I could shine like the morning sun, like the sun.
We end with a hymn.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.